Welcome to the deep dive. If your head is spinning from the sheer volume of political news lately, high court decisions, legislative battles dragging on, those little hints from early elections, well, you're definitely in the right place. Our mission today is really to cut through all that noise. We're going to take a deep dive into some key developments from recent electoral vote news, pull out the most important bits, maybe some surprising facts, just to help you get a solid handle on these pretty complex topics.
Yeah, and we've got quite a mix for you today. It's really a fascinating cross-section of American governance and electoral stuff. Our sources touch on everything from, how the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution, which can be pretty nuanced, to the really messy reality of making laws in Congress, the sausage making, as they say.
Right.
And even those subtle signals coming out of special elections. We'll try and connect the dots, show how these things that seemed separate are actually, well, pretty deeply intertwined. They paint a bigger picture, really, of where power sits in America today.
Okay, let's unpack this with a really big one first. The Supreme Court's ruling in Trump v. CASA, Inc. This just came down on June 28th. Essentially, the court said that district courts, generally speaking, don't have the authority to issue injunctions that apply beyond the specific parties in the lawsuit. They were quite clear, saying nationwide injunctions, quote, likely exceed the equitable authority that Congress has granted to federal courts.
And it's really interesting how this case even got to the Supreme Court. It came up through what's called the shadow docket.
Ah, the shadow docket.
Yeah, it's this faster, less transparent way they handle emergency appeals. Basically, 3 different district courts had already issued preliminary injunctions against the specific executive order from Donald Trump. That order, it basically tried to say that U.S.-born citizens aren't citizens anymore if their father wasn't a citizen and their mother entered the U.S. unlawfully or, temporarily.
Trying to get around the 14th Amendment.
Exactly. Trying to put them outside the citizenship clause.
Yeah.
So the lower courts looked at this and said, look, this EO is probably unconstitutional. And they blocked it from applying to everyone and not just the people suing.
And the Supreme Court's take on these broader injunctions, they didn't like them. They called them universal injunctions, and the tone was pretty negative, pejorative. What we found in the source material is this observation that, okay, yeah, misusing these injunctions is a problem. They point to Judge Kaczmarek's Mifepristone injunction as one example.
Right.
But the new thing, the source argues, isn't the injunction itself, it's this judge shopping.
Judge shopping, yeah. That's when, people filing lawsuits strategically pick a specific court, hoping to get a judge they think will give them a really broad, maybe overreaching order. And if you connect this back, the court was actually, well, pretty savvy in how it handled this. It framed the question very narrowly. They focused only on whether district courts have the power to issue these nationwide preliminary injunctions. By doing that, the actual facts of Trump's executive order, the citizenship stuff, suddenly became, quote, irrelevant to their legal question.
Ah, okay.
So it let them, as the source puts it, kill 2 birds with 1 stone. They could talk about nationwide injunctions in this abstract way and at the same time give Trump what's seen as another win on his signature issue of ridding the country of as many undesirables as possible.
So, okay, practically speaking then, what does this mean right now? If injunctions only cover the specific people who sued, does that create this weird patchwork of protection?
It could, yeah.
It sounds like there's a lot of ambiguity, especially thinking about the states involved.
Absolutely. The potential for, well, chaos is pretty significant. You hit the nail on the head. Imagine only people living in states that actually join the lawsuit are protected for now. So others could potentially lose their citizenship, or maybe newborns could be denied Social Security numbers, all while the case is still going on. It's an administrative nightmare, obviously, but also a human one. And the analysis we looked at points out that class action lawsuits aren't really a great alternative here. They just take too long.
Right.
Plus, think about it. If the administration loses in a lower court, but the ruling only affects a few people, what's their incentive to appeal? They might just let it stand because the impact is so limited.
Yeah, why risk a bigger loss?
Exactly. And this ruling, it takes effect in 30 days. It sort of builds on another order they previously stayed, one about deporting people to third countries without due process. It really does raise questions about the immediate impact on real lives.
That is a terrifying prospect. It almost sounds like it's designed to make it harder to challenge these kinds of executive actions effectively. And this brings us straight to Justice Sotomayor's dissent, doesn't it? Which was incredibly strong. She really laid out a stark concern, saying the court basically kneecaps the judiciary's authority to stop the executive from enforcing even the most unconstitutional policies, just takes away that power from federal courts.
It was a powerful dissent. And then on the other side, you have Justice Kavanaugh's concurrence.
Right.
Which is also, frankly, eye-opening. It essentially, as the source reads it, advises the Trump faithful to bring more emergency applications to the Supreme Court to get lower court orders stayed.
So use the shadow docket more.
Pretty much. Our sources call this a stunning expansion of the court's involvement in cases at earlier stages, especially since it's happening through that less transparent shadow docket. It's seen by some observers as, saying the quiet part out loud, like a clear signal the Supreme Court is ready to step in and, quote, bail them out.
Okay, so speaking of institutions and power, maybe using it, maybe giving it away, let's shift focus now to Capitol Hill, Congress. The legislative gears are definitely grinding, especially with this huge MAGAbill, or sometimes called the MAGAbill. The Senate just voted to advance it late on a Saturday night. It was almost entirely party line, 51-49, and that vote was held open for like 3 hours.
Yeah, 3 hours. Classic sausage making, as our sources called it.
You can just picture the horse trading, right? Like Senator Ron Johnson holding out until he got changes he wanted on Medicaid rules, then flipping his vote.
Oh, absolutely. And the opposition was solid. All the Democrats voted no, plus 2 Republicans, Rand Paul, who, tends to vote against most big spending anyway,
Right.
and Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina. He was really worried. Said his state stood to lose something like $38 billion in funding, and he was concerned about rural hospitals closing.
So this whole legislative maneuvering, it's suddenly given a lot of power to a couple of other Republicans, hasn't it? Susan Collins from Maine, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, especially if Paul and Tillis stick to their no votes.
That's right.
Collins, she's up for re-election next year, and her polling in Maine is, well, pretty bad. Like 14% favorable, 57% unfavorable. That's rough.
Very rough.
Especially when the Democratic governor there, Janet Mills, has a 51% approval rating.
Yeah, and Murkowski, she isn't up next year, but she's been making noise about maybe caucusing with the Democrats. So you could definitely see them teaming up, threatening to vote no, and using that leverage, as the source colorfully puts it, to arrange for their states to get more pork than Iowa produces in a decade.
Probably right. And we saw some stalling tactics too, didn't we? Like Chuck Schumer forcing the whole 940-page bill to be read aloud.
Yes, that took 16 hours. Schumer's point was, Americans deserve to know what's actually in this thing. He framed it as tax breaks for billionaires while ordinary families lose health care and food assistance. And we should expect a vote-a-rama soon.
Yeah.
That's where Democrats just offer amendment after amendment. They probably won't pass, but the goal is to highlight unpopular parts of the bill and try to sway public opinion.
So looking ahead, what happens with this bill? It still has to get through the House, right? They either have to just accept the Senate version,
Which seems unlikely.
or it goes to a conference committee to hammer out a compromise between the House and Senate versions. And who sits on that committee is crucial.
Absolutely. You get one Freedom Caucus member on there, they could potentially blow the whole thing up. Or if they keep him off, maybe the compromise still fails in the full House.
And there are other sticking points, like changes to the SALT cap potentially hurting moderate Republicans from places like New York and California.
Right. But it's also worth pointing out, as bad as this bill might seem to opponents, our sources note it could have been even worse.
How so?
Well, the Senate parliamentarian did this thing called the bird bath. It's basically a check to make sure everything in the bill is strictly related to the budget, because that's required for this kind of reconciliation process. And she stripped out quite a few provisions, things like certain Medicaid changes, a private school tax credit, a ban on gender-affirming care, selling off federal lands, limits on food aid.
Wow.
And interestingly, connecting back to our earlier discussion, she also cut proposed limits on the power of federal courts to issue those nationwide injunctions.
So that specific attempt to curb judicial power through legislation got axed.
For now, yes. So the takeaway is the sausage grinder is working at full speed. It might take days, maybe even weeks, before we know what the final version of this bill actually looks like.
It's really easy to get bogged down in the details of, one court ruling or one bill. But when you step back, one of the sources we looked at points to this larger, maybe even unsettling pattern. They're suggesting that what we're seeing isn't necessarily Trump just grabbing power aggressively, but maybe the other two branches, Congress and the judiciary, kind of just handing it to him, like on a golden platter.
It's a really compelling observation, and frankly, a bit alarming when you think about it. Let's look at some examples the source gives. Tariffs, for instance. The Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, clearly gives Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises.
Right, the power of the purse.
Exactly. But Congress didn't really assert that power to stop Trump's tariffs. Similarly, Congress has the power to declare war, but it wasn't really used to check or condemn actions regarding Iran, emergency powers. Congress never really clarified what counts as an invasion, which basically lets the president declare almost anything an emergency.
Ceding power there, too.
Yeah. And even states' powers seem to have been given away. Congress didn't clarify who controls the National Guard in certain situations, even though it's normally under state command. And then maybe the starkest example is back to the Supreme Court and birthright citizenship. The source argues the court caved.
Instead of just striking down the executive order as obviously unconstitutional?
Right. Instead of doing that, they essentially said courts can't fully enforce the Constitution against the executive in this way, effectively ceding its power to the executive branch, voluntarily. The source feels very strongly here, saying the court could have just struck down the EO9D with a really sharp opinion saying, look, we, the Supreme Court, decide what the Constitution means, not the president.
That is a pretty damning assessment, this idea of a paucity of profiles and courage, as the source puts it. But, I mean, is it really voluntary ceding, or could there be some strategy behind it? Maybe the other branches are just choosing battles, avoiding direct fights for political reasons.
That's a fair question. Is it strategy or abdication?
Either way, the picture painted is one where maybe this expansion of presidential power didn't just happen because the executive was aggressive, but because the other branches didn't push back hard enough. They sort of let it happen. And the source makes this provocative point that Republicans, maybe expecting, in the source's words, a 1,000-year Reich, aren't thinking about what happens if the other party gets control and uses these newly expanded executive powers.
It's a risk, right. Setting precedents that could be used against you later seems to be overlooked in the heat of the moment.
Okay, so from the big picture power dynamics in Washington, let's shift now and try to read the electoral tea leaves a bit. What are the early signs telling us about future elections? First up, Tom Tillis. His surprise retirement announcement for 2026. This came even while Trump was, as the source said, pummeling him over his vote against the MAGAbill.
Yeah, that was unexpected. And the consequences are pretty significant. First, now that he can't be primaried by a Trump-backed challenger, he's basically free to vote based on what his constituents want. Trump doesn't have much leverage over him anymore.
Interesting.
But maybe more importantly, holding that North Carolina Senate seat in 2026 just got a lot harder for Republicans. It's now an open seat.
And former Governor Roy Cooper, the Democrat, might jump in.
He's been playing it cool, but yeah, winning an open seat in a swing state like North Carolina, that looks much more doable now. Cooper's a seasoned politician. He knows the kind of money that would pour in. The source says finance will not be a problem.
And for the Republicans?
Well, the primary field is wide open now. That could mean a big, messy primary and potentially what they call a candidate quality problem if maybe the Trumpiest, most extreme candidate wins the nomination. That can be tough in a general election.
Right. And speaking of potentially tough Senate races for Republicans, let's look at Susan Collins again in Maine. Her unpopularity is really stark.
It really is.
That new polling, only 14% favorable, 57% unfavorable. And Governor Janet Mills, the Democrat, sitting at 51% approval. Mills is term limited as governor. She hasn't said she'll run against Collins, but with numbers like that, you got to think Democrats will move heaven and earth to try and recruit her. That looks like a prime pickup opportunity.
Definitely one to watch. Now, on a slightly different front, but still looking ahead, consider Governor Gavin Newsom in California.
Yes, the lawsuit against Fox News.
Exactly. Suing them for $787 million, claiming defamation by Jesse Waters. This would say a very clear signal he's gearing up for a 2028 presidential run.
And he's pretty open about the strategy, right?
Oh, yeah. He's basically saying he's using a tactic Trump has used, and he even tied the dollar amount directly to the Dominion settlement, the $787.5 million. He said, quote, "If Fox News wants to lie to the American people on Donald Trump's behalf, it should face consequences."
Now, legally, it's tough for him, isn't it? As a public figure, he has to prove actual malice. That's a high bar. Show they knew it was false or just didn't care if it was true or false.
Much higher bar than Dominion faced, yes. But the source suggests his real goal might not be winning in a court of law.
It's the court of public opinion.
Exactly. Rallying Democrats, getting his name out there, taking the fight to Fox News. We should probably expect, as the source says, more stunts like this from Newsom leading up to 2028.
Okay, let's talk special elections. We're seeing this interesting dynamic play out sometimes, youth versus the establishment.
Yeah, popping up. Now, Zohran Mamdani's win in the NYC mayoral primary had some unique local factors, maybe not the best example. But Arizona's special election in AZ07 that's coming up July 15th looks like a clearer test case.
Right, that's the seat that opened up after Representative Raul Grijalva passed away. It's a heavily Latino district, somewhat poor.
Mm-hmm.
And the candidates are really distinct. On the establishment side, you have Adelita Grijalva. She's 54, the former congressman's daughter. Lots of political experience, Tucson School Board for years, Pima County Board of Supervisors. Though she had to resign because of a resign-to-run law.
Seen as very establishment, maybe even a Nepo baby, as the source puts it.
And then the youth candidate is Deja Fox. She's only 25. Filipino-American, grew up in public housing, first in her family to go to college, went to Columbia. She's a political activist, even spoke at the 2024 Democratic Convention about abortion rights. A real Gen Z candidate in what is a relatively young state.
So the question this race poses, really for you, the listener, to think about is, will generational change do the job when the older candidate is a fairly standard politician with no obvious flaws?
Yeah, it's not like Grijalva has major scandals or anything.
Exactly. And since it's a D+13 district, whoever wins this Democratic primary is almost certainly going to Congress. It's different from, say, the VA11 primary, where James Walkinshaw won. He's 42, not exactly ancient, and that race seemed more about his experience as the previous congressman's chief of staff, less about just age.
Okay, so let's zoom out again and really try to, read those tea leaves from all the special election data we've seen this year. Thinking about the 2026 midterms. Special elections, they're always unique, special, as the name implies, but historically they often do give us some clues about broader trends.
They can, yeah. And the data so far this cycle is pretty compelling. Since January 20th, 2025, there have been 31 special elections. And in 27 of them, Democrats performed better than Joe Biden, well, technically Kamala Harris, did in those same districts in 2024.
27 out of 31. That's a strong trend.
It is. And it holds across different kinds of places. In Trumpy states, Democrats ran ahead of Harris's 2024 numbers. Same in closer states, even in solid blue states.
There was that wild New York State Senate race example.
Yeah, the 22nd district moved something like 94 points towards the Democrats, apparently due to shifts in Orthodox Jewish voting patterns. And even in a couple of Florida House races that Republicans won, the Democrats still did much better than Harris did in 2024.
Okay, but how predictive is this, really? I remember hearing special elections weren't great predictors for 2024 itself.
That's true. Historically, they were pretty good for 2018, 2020, 2022 House results. But 2024 was different. Our sources point to unusual factors, Biden dropping out late, Trump maybe turning out low-propensity voters who don't usually show up for specials.
So 2024 might have been the exception, not the rule.
It's possible. So looking at this year's specials, with that D+13 on average swing towards Democrats compared to 2024, plus what the sources see as the increasing unpopularity of the Republicans, well, it gives Democrats some reason for optimism in 2026.
One more potential indicator.
Yeah, one more, though it's still early days, the Virginia gubernatorial election this November. Historically, it's got a decent track record, maybe a 70% prediction rate for the following midterms.
And the early polling there.
A recent Roanoke College poll shows Representative Abigail Spanberger, the Democrat, leading Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl Sears, the Republican, pretty comfortably 43 to 26%.
So Spanberger looks like the favorite right now.
She does. And if she wins, particularly if she wins comfortably, that would be seen as another hint about 2026.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. We took that deep dive into, well, all these interconnected stories, the judiciary's power, Congress being gridlocked, executive actions, those little signals from voters in special elections. It's really clear how they all weave together to shape the political landscape.
Yeah, and understanding these different threads, how they connect, really lets you see the bigger picture beyond just daily headlines, doesn't it? You know, how the Supreme Court sees its own power, how Congress uses its authority or maybe gives it away, and how these early election results might hint at what's coming next. It all adds up to a much richer understanding of American governance right now.
It really does. And this raises, I think, a really important question to leave you with. What are the long-term consequences for the actual balance of power in the U.S. when one branch, the executive, seems to be growing stronger, not just because it's being aggressive, but maybe because the other branches, Congress and the judiciary, are voluntarily ceding their own authority? As we see these trends potentially continue, and what role does public awareness, public engagement play in maybe influencing these big constitutional shifts, especially as we're already looking ahead to the really crucial elections in 2026 and 2028? Something to think about.